Word nerds talking about words. Yeah! Welcome to Word Nerds, the show where nerds talk about words. Today's special is something fishy. First part, protein skimmers. We've brought in resident word nerds Courtney Hansen and Hannah Vlar to talk to us about what is a protein skimmer. What is its French equivalent? So let's give them a big round of applause. Welcome to Word Nerds.
Welcome to the show. So nice to have you
for
on the side
having
of the
us.
table.
Thank you.
Well, ladies, would you like to start by telling us about the words that you were researching and where you looked to find their definitions?
Sure. Well, to start off, my word was protein skimmer.
And my word was écumeur de protéines.
Ooh, those sound like equivalents.
We'll get into equivalency a little later.
Oh.
Yeah. First, the definitions.
What is a protein skimmer? That's what we asked ourselves when we first started researching this term.
Hannah, would you like to read the definitions so that the audience at back home can see what this says?
Courtney, I would be honored. A protein skimmer is a device used to remove organic compounds such as food and waste particles from water.
Interesting.
And is that the definition that was given on Termia?
This is the termium definition,
Okay.
which, getting back to your question, is where I started my search for protein skimmer.
Oh, a good place to start.
What did Termia have to say?
Well, termium listed 3 different terms you could use. They were all stated to be correct. So you have protein skimmer as the first one, the preferred, foam fractionator, and skimmer.
Oh, interesting.
Oh.
However, we need to talk about the sourcing.
That's always a good place to look. So what sources were given for these terms?
We had the same problem in English and in French.
Oh no.
The source, Wikipedia. Now we all know as word nerds that Wikipedia is a great place to get information.
Yeah.
It's a great place to start research, but it should never be the end point.
Exactly. So, we took the next steps. We went and we did a broad search. We cast a wide net. Excuse my something fishy pun.
She's so good with words.
What a nerd. Yeah. So where did you cast this net that we'll talk about? On
Well-
that net, perhaps?
On the net, exactly. We looked at vendors, manufacturers, and we were even able to find some scientific journals and reports through the school library database.
Those sound like some authoritative sources in the
Much
realm
more
of
authoritative
protein
than
skimmers.
Wikipedia.
Great. And did all of those sources use the term protein skimmer? Did you find some other sources on there?
Well, I did find that protein skimmer is the most broadly used term.
Okay.
Yeah, but foam fractionator came up on occasion, and it's interesting because foam fractionator seemed to be used more in the scientific texts, or I found it on a Government of Canada website. So it seems to be more formal, more specialized.
Okay. But it did kind of have the same definition as a protein
It had the
skimmer.
same
It can be
definition.
used in the
They
same
were
context.
used interchangeably sometimes. So I think the issue here is they're near synonyms. They
Okay.
have the same definition, but are maybe used in a different context.
And what did you find for écumeur de protéines? Did it seem to have the same results, or?
Not quite. In French, I found that écumeur de protéines was most widely used across the vendor websites, and I would have liked to use a corpora to continue my research a little more extensively. But I figured that the vendors who sell this product were an authoritative resource for this term, because they're the ones who are making the product and selling it, so they should know, hopefully,
How
what
it's
to call
called.
their
Oh,
product.
yeah.
And I did a lot of research, and I found écumeur de protéines over and over again on different vendor websites. And it wasn't until I found a Canadian company. Do you remember the name of that company?
It was called Flugel. It's
Flugel.
based in Quebec.
It's based in Quebec, and they're a French-first company. And I found that they use the term écumeur de protéines.
Interesting.
Sounds like a different spelling than the first word that you were looking for, écumeur. Did it have the same meaning?
It did. It appeared to have the same meaning, so I did some further research. I went to my dictionaries.
Oh, good place to
I
go.
love dictionaries.
Every word nerd knows.
And dictionaries are written sometimes for a language as a whole, but sometimes for specific regions. So I went to a French dictionary that was written for a France audience. And in that dictionary, I found the term écumeur. And in a French dictionary for a Québécois audience, I found the term écumoire.
Interesting.
So I noticed the variation in region, the regional difference here on the term, and then I looked at the GDT, the Grand Dictionnaire Terminologique, for the same terms, and I found the same thing. Both écumeur de protéines and écumoire de protéines were listed, and Écumoire de protéines sourced a Québécois resource, and Écumeur de protéines sourced a French from France resource.
Interesting.
And the English equivalent, skimmer.
Protein
Oh,
skimmer.
perfect. So they
Okay.
are
Skimmer,
equivalent.
skimmer.
Well,
All right.
perfect. Well, we're running out of time, but do you have, just as a final thought, any recommendations for the terminologists over at Termium?
I would say for the English, the terms are all correct. They were used properly. Maybe put a little note that foam fractionator is more specialized than
Okay.
protein skimmer, and protein skimmer is the common term.
Interesting.
For the French term, I would say you need to denote the regional difference. It's always good to be more thorough than less thorough when you're doing
Absolutely.
terminological
And probably the
research.
Canadian audience would want to know as well if there's a spelling that's preferred in Canada.
Absolutely.
Or the Québécois French.
Well,
And
perfect.
then, of course,
Most importantly,
get better sourcing.
Oh,
The
yeah.
documentation is out there.
it's out there. It's found. People just need to do the research.
Yeah, dig
So-
a little bit deeper.
Exactly.
Well, there you
All
have
right.
it, folks. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this very special episode of Word Nerds.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right,
We
we'll
love
see you
talking
next
about
time.
words.
Just get giddy when I think about them.
Let's go skim some stuff. Woo!
Word Nerds, talking about words. Yeah!
Welcome to Word Nerds, the show where nerds talk about words. This is our special two-part episode, Something Fishy. Part 2, Boat Wind, or Vent Vitesse. Hello, and welcome back to Word Nerds. Welcome to part 2 of our show. We're going to invite Katie and Sarah, experts on the terms, to come and talk to us about boating and the great winds of sailing.
So please give a round of applause for our wonderful word nerds.
Wow.
Thank you.
It's great to be on the show. Thanks for having us.
We're great. We're so happy to host you today.
I'm just so excited. I've always wanted to be on the show. Big fan.
Well, great. We're glad you can be
So glad you
here.
have the opportunity.
So, can you start by telling us a bit about your term?
Sure.
What does it mean?
research-
Where did you look for it?
Well, I'd never heard of either terms before.
What are your terms?
Starting
Can you just announce to
digging.
our
Oh,
audience?
well, my term was boat wind.
And mine was Vent Vitesse,
Hmm.
which is listed as the equivalent term to boat wind on Termium.
Yeah, so that's actually where we went first to look for them, was Termium, because of course, government resource and everything. It was, yeah,
It was a good place to go.
a good place to go. But I found that once I looked at the sources for the Termium, and it wasn't really clear. It cited the Language Institute or something like that of the government of Canada, but it didn't lead anywhere. I looked up that institute and couldn't find it. So I tried to find some more. I did just a general Google search at first to find boatwind, just to see how it was used. I was going to create my own corpora because I wasn't sure about the Termium sources, but I could not find anything that contained boatwind in it.
How interesting.
Yeah.
And it was in Termium.
It was in Termium, and eventually, after lots of digging, even with the University of Ottawa library website, some really structured Google searches, I managed to find a couple of sources where boatwind was used, but mostly it's not really a widely used term. And I even called up one of my friends from back home. He's been sailing.
Call them now?
I can call them
Sorry,
now.
I think your phone is ringing.
Oh, yeah, it's my expert. It's Mr. Greg Slakov on the phone. Hello, Greg. What's that? You've looked around and asked all your sailing buddies about the term boat wind. What's that? No one has ever heard that term ever in their life. Nobody at the sailing club? No. Well, interesting. Well, thank you so much, Greg. Well, that.
Wow.
Thank you,
What
Greg.
serendipitous
Shocking.
timing.
Whoa.
Now, as we know on Word Nerds, it's important to consult specialists in a
Yeah.
field to learn more about a term.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Greg.
And he was great. He's been sailing for over 40 years, so I went straight to him.
Great.
Yeah.
Were you able to find any other
Well, there was
documentation?
one guy I found on a YouTube video. His name is Captain John. He does Captain John skipper tips.
Can you trust Captain John? He's a YouTube video.
Oh, well, I looked up his website, and oh my goodness, his sources, his experience. He is a reputable source, and he did actually use boatwind when he was explaining some physics behind boating. Sarah has a better understanding of it than I do.
Well, she did show me this video from Captain John and his skipper tips, and I thought it was very intriguing because also researching vent vitesse, I was trying to understand what this word meant, what the term meant, and what it actually represented. So Skipper John helped us understand what it actually meant, and I put together this little diagram here to show some different types of wind. That's him there. He also allegedly, he may be a pirate. So he's been represented as such in this drawing. So as you'll see, boat wind, I've put in quotation marks here because we were discussing the validity of the term, but it is represented in some documentation as boat wind. It's also termed relative wind in some places that you look. So what really happens is that when you're sailing, there's a true wind, which is the atmospheric wind that is blowing, whether you're standing still, whether you're moving, you'll feel it because it's the wind in the air.
Yeah.
It's occurring naturally.
So if one of our viewers was sitting outside watching this episode, would they feel true wind?
They would feel true wind.
Okay.
If there was wind that day, atmospheric wind, they would feel the true wind.
All right.
But if they're on some kind of moving object, like if you're riding a bicycle.
They're watching our show while riding a bike.
Exactly. Or running, as people do sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
That movement of the moving object, like if you're on a boat sailing through the water, the movement of that boat will create wind on your face. You'll feel that.
Of course.
But then what
So
happens?
what is that? What is that wind called?
Well, that is the point under debate. But in the term presented in Termium is boat wind, and the French term presented is vent vitesse. But really, in English documentation, you don't see boat wind really come up at all. But it is sometimes referred to as relative wind, and vent relatif as well in French.
Okay.
But that is a term that can be applied to not specifically to boats, but really to any moving object. So I gave the example of someone riding a bike, and that wind that creates the movement of the bike is creating can be called relative wind.
So would you say then that the two terms are actually equivalent?
I would say no, actually. My term goes to, or if you use boat wind, because it is sometimes used by experts explaining the physics behind boating, it's very specific to the field of boating, whereas vent vitesse.
Yeah, vent vitesse is used in boating, but it's also maybe a little bit broader. So they're not necessarily equivalent term. Well, they can be considered equivalents, but there are slightly different usages of those terms.
Vent vitesse is used in a much broader sense than boat wind.
Okay. Now, did you find any other uses of these terms in any other sources or fields outside of boating?
Not particularly. Vent vitesse. Well, I'll talk about my term for a little bit. So vent vitesse is a term that's used to talk about, that's used in sailing a little bit. Again, it was a little bit hard to find documentation because sailing is such a limited field. There isn't like a great body of documentation on sailing because it's fairly specialized and there isn't a lot written up about it.
It's very practical.
It's very practical, certainly, and there aren't big, extensive papers written about these terms. But there are sailing manuals out there and certain guides and certain glossaries that do use these terms. So vent vitesse did come up in those.
And those are great resources to look for terms as well.
Absolutely. So it was used in those, but the question that I'm answering right now is...
Did you find your term anywhere else in any other fields?
Yes. So it is a term for sailing, but in addition to the Termium record for vent vitesse, there was a secondary term that was listed as, which was vent relatif, which I mentioned earlier. And vent relatif is sometimes used to refer to this wind that's created by a boat's movement. But unfortunately, it's also a term that's used in aerodynamics and the theory of gas, as well as meteorology.
Oh, wow, that's not sailing at all.
It's not sailing at all, and unfortunately, in that context, it actually has a slightly different meaning. And so that causes a little bit of ambiguity there.
Of course.
And the Termium record actually is listed in the domain of sailing as well as aerodynamics, and it lists both of these terms, but relative wind, or vent relatif, sorry, in French, has different meanings depending on which domain you're talking about. So one of my recommendations for Termium would be to definitely put a note on that, saying that if you use relative vent relatif, you'll cause some confusion, and also to create a second entry in the domain of aerodynamics. Because if you keep them lumped together, because they don't have the same meaning, then really all word nerds know that if you're going to have a term record, you should really only be representing one concept with one record.
Exactly.
And this record is representing two completely different concepts, and that needs to be indicated through termium.
Interesting. Thank you for your advice on that. Did you
Yeah,
find
it
the
causes
same
a bit of
in
clarification.
Or in English?
In the English,
Yes,
excuse me.
it's okay. In the English, I definitely found that they needed to add a bit of a disclaimer in there for boat wind, because it's very, very rarely used. It's it takes hours of research just to find it on the internet. I would say they need to add a disclaimer saying, yes, this is used, but people in the sailing field don't use it. There isn't really actually an English equivalent for vent vitesse, because it's something the sailors find that they don't need to use. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your opinions. Do you have any final questions for our word nerds today?
I did have one. I was wondering if there were any other versions of vent vitesse that you found anywhere.
Well, I did actually. So when I was doing my research for vent vitesse, I started by looking at termium sources, which was Wikipedia, which was something that we found earlier in today's program for protein skimmer, équilibre protein. The sources were Wikipedia.
Gosh, Wikipedia is ubiquitous.
It really is, and it's not always the most reliable. So for vent vitesse, those were the only sources that were given, and so I wanted to dig a little bit deeper, and I looked around just on the internet using vent vitesse kind of in quotations to make sure it was kept together as a term, and that didn't yield a lot of results. And I also searched specifically sailing sites because I figured they would be more authoritative sources, and vent vitesse did show up on some of those. They were primarily French sites. So then what I wanted to do is I went to GDT because I thought that's another term bank. It's Canadian, so maybe they'll have some sources for me. So I searched the term boat wind to see what would come up, and two terms actually did surface. They had two on GDT. One of them was vent de vitesse, which is like the termium term vent vitesse, but with the little thrown in there just to kind of mix things up. And the other term given was vent vitesse with a hyphen. So then using these two terms, I started scouring the same sites I'd looked for vent vitesse. And what I found was that vent de vitesse showed up on some, primarily Belgian sites.
Interesting.
And vent vitesse with a hyphen was absolutely nowhere to be found. So I kind of got rid of that idea because I thought, if that's not going to show up anywhere, and if GDT isn't giving me a source, I don't know where it's coming from, and it wasn't being used anywhere. So
should GDT just take that out of their records
well, I'd
altogether?
like to know where they found that term, so I would maybe ask the folks at GDT. But since we were focusing on termium here, I decided to just set that aside and push forward with what was reliable. So I did find that vent de vitesse was a reliable term. It was mostly used on Belgian sites, as I said, and other European sites. And then vent vitesse was often coming up on French sites, so I thought that for termium it would be useful to add vent de vitesse, add it to the record, and keep vent vitesse as well as a recommended term.
Great. Thank you so much for your wisdom on these terms.
Well, thank you for your
so
time.
much for
It's
having
great to talk about all this information that we've uncovered. It's just such a passion.
Fascinating information we've heard today.
I love speaking with fellow word nerds.
Have you ever
me
had
too.
such a thrilling show? We've really dove into it today.
Oh.
Well, maybe we'll come back to you next week with more words.
More terms. We can't wait.
Oh my
Thank you
goodness.
so much for visiting us today.
Thank you for having us.
Well, audience, that's all we have for today. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah.
We sing a theme song. Fishy. We can sing the theme song. Would you like to sing it with us?
I would love to. It's a dream.
Okay, here we go.
Word nerds talking about words.